I'm delighted to welcome back one of my previous and long-standing sponsors. It's Get Doper. I've worked with Get Doper now for over a year, and I've been taking it myself. What they include in the supplement is 16 powerful nootropic ingredients in one smart supplement. I'm really passionate about Get Doper because it works. And this is why we keep inviting them back to sponsor the podcast, because I love the fact that it is specifically targeted for neurodivergent brains and nervous systems. So it's been created by Matt Buff, who is also neurodivergent himself, and he's recognizing how needed a supplement was for other neurodivergent brains. And he really wanted to hone in on getting the right supplement that helps with cognition, with energy, with memory, with focus, and mood. And I would say it ticks all those boxes. And I take it pretty much every day when I remember. I have it on my desk. And I have to say, it really does help me. It helps me focus that attention. It regulates my mood. I do notice that I'm probably a bit more articulate when I take it. I can really find those words. And sometimes with my working memory or just word finding, I struggle. But I notice that difference when I take Get Doper. And I would say that if you are looking for something to help you keep your brain healthy and help aid the formation, the growth, and the repair of your brain cells, while also protecting your brain with these powerful antioxidants, Get Doper is the supplement for you. So it's been recommended by fantastic experts, specialists, including Dr. Rachel Gow, who's a nutritional neuroscientist. And if you go and have a look at those reviews, you'll know it works. They've got a fantastic community. Head to getdoper.com. Give it a go. Try it out. I promise you, you will notice a difference. Now, you can also take Get Doper alongside your medication. But if you are finding that maybe the medication hasn't quite worked, or if you are waiting for a diagnosis or you're waiting for more help with your titration, Get Doper is a seriously good option for you. So I am really delighted to be able to offer 10% off if you use the code KATE10. You go to getdoper.com, use my code KATE10, you will get 10% off. And I really hope that you find Get Doper as helpful as I do. Welcome to the ADHD Women's Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Kate Moore-Youssef, and I'm a wellbeing and lifestyle coach, EFT practitioner, mum to 4 kids, and passionate about helping more women to understand and accept their amazing ADHD brains. After speaking to many women just like me, and probably you, I know there is a need for more health and lifestyle support for women newly diagnosed with ADHD. In these conversations, you'll learn from insightful guests, hear new findings, and discover powerful perspectives and lifestyle tools to enable you to live your most fulfilled, calm, and purposeful life wherever you are on your ADHD journey. Here's today's episode. I am so delighted to welcome in Natalie Englander today. We're talking perfectionism. And Natalie is an accredited CBT therapist, and she has helped hundreds of perfectionists overcome anxiety, stop overthinking, beat procrastination, and build self-confidence while they are discovering their late diagnosed ADHD. Now, Natalie was diagnosed as well later on in life, and she's probably been helping lots of other late diagnosed ADHD people, whether they're aware or not. And now that you have this understanding of your own ADHD, guiding other people to maybe see if it has been ADHD that has been dictating their perfectionism. So Natalie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel like I'm slightly fangirling because I've listened to so many of your episodes on your podcast.
Well, you see how I'm winging it now, can't you? You can see it's like not the most professional, way, but this is how we do it. And interestingly is that I also used to be a bit of a perfectionist. And now for me, letting go of that and just kind of like we had this conversation off air, and it's a bit like, yeah, if the dog barks, the doorbell rings, if we make a mistake, it's all fine. Like it's editable. And if it's not editable, this is the podcast, and this is what people get. And hopefully, bumps and all, it's worthwhile, even if maybe sometimes it doesn't feel as professional as I would like.
Yeah. No one actually really wants that polished version of things anyway. If you think on social media, the stuff we prefer is when we're seeing the more kind of raw truths and people's mistakes and mishaps and things. Generally, we actually prefer that.
Oh, 100%. So let's sort of rewind a little bit because I know that you have been a therapist for about 12 years now. I wonder, was your perfectionism the reason why you thought, right, I need to help other people here, and that's why you specialized in it? And I guess how did that show up for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think probably from when I was a teenager and you had to pick your A levels, I did psychology and loved it and thought, I think I want to do something in this area. But alongside that, at the same time, is probably when my perfectionism started. Um, and I guess it definitely had quite an impact on my life in a negative way, just sort of constantly striving for perfection all of the time, kind of in all areas. And I guess as I got into my 20s and started my CBT training and working with people, I was just sort of more drawn to working with the perfectionists, I guess the ones who come along struggling with anxiety or depression, sorry, but really what's going on and what's sort of keeping the problem going and is maybe a part of why they do a piece of work on their anxiety and depression and it gets better, but it comes back again a year later or 5 years later. It's because there's that sort of unresolved perfectionism stuff going on that they haven't really worked on.
What's interesting is that we do hear this word perfectionism being bandied around. It's very topical. You know, you can say attribute it to maybe sort of TikTok videos and all of that. But what is when you're seeing it as a therapist and not as this sort of very surface layer of like your house being very tidy or your hair always being done and your makeup flawless? Like, what does it look like on, I guess, the most debilitating level?
Yeah, I guess on the most debilitating level, it's where essentially you're basing your self-worth on your achievements. So you're kind of only feeling as good as whatever your latest achievement is. And then if you don't achieve whatever the goal is that you'd set for yourself, then you feel absolutely rubbish about yourself. And I guess that's quite a dangerous place to be when your self worth is dependent on whether you're achieving or not, as opposed to always feeling worthy, regardless of whether or not you fail at something, or you don't pass an exam, or you make a mistake, or you don't get the job that you interviewed for. And I guess it can just keep people really stuck in some very unhelpful patterns, whether that's procrastinating, we're putting things off because we just feel like the pressure's too great because it needs to be perfect, or if we're
Mm.
constantly criticizing ourselves. And there's so much shame, I think, that comes along with that really sort of unhelpful or unhealthy perfectionism. And of course, it can contribute towards anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorders. So it can have a really negative impact for sure.
Thank you for explaining that because it is really important that we sort of scratch beneath that surface and we understand that it's not just this surface. Like, you know, when you talk about eating disorders and anxiety and depression, and it being fueled by this need to feel validated and worthy. And often that begins as children. If we're talking ADHD and perfectionism, what do you think those links are, especially if we're sort of going back to childhood and looking at those beginning patterns of it?
Yeah, well, I think for lots of people with ADHD, whether they've been diagnosed when they were younger or if they've not been diagnosed until later life, so I guess we're going through their childhood with undiagnosed ADHD, is that the perfectionism can develop as a way to either cope with or sort of compensate for the struggles that they might be having with their ADHD symptoms, whether it's stuff to do with inattentiveness and they're forgetful. And that can create lots of shame or self criticism, or also, I guess, criticism from other people, you know, teachers, parents. Why haven't you done your homework? Why have you forgotten to bring your books or whatever? Um, and yeah, I think it sort of makes sense that so many people do develop perfectionism as a way to cope with having ADHD. Um, and that's why I think I often feel like we don't want to sort of slate perfectionism too much, which I think we can have a tendency to do because, of course, it can be really awful and it can be really unhelpful. But actually, sometimes it can also be healthy and helpful. And I think, particularly for people with ADHD, it can, yeah, develop as a way to help them cope. They may be doing things almost a sort of scaffold life where perhaps they are now appearing really organized, but that's because they know if they don't write everything down or if they don't keep their calendar organized, they're not going to remember any of it, and then they will be late or they will forget things.
Yeah, I think definitely we'll come on to that conversation, but I think it's important to say that there's been this scaffolding, but it's also overcompensating, and it's quite an exhausting way to live, isn't it? When you're constantly second guessing yourself, you don't trust yourself, so everything, like you say, everything has to be written down, double checking, rechecking, not feeling confident that what you've put out into the world isn't going to be criticized. Um, I mean, I remember now, like, my handwriting's always been abysmal. And people have said, oh, you've got a writing of like a 3-year-old, or is that how you're going to be organized? Like when they see kind of like my notes or whatever. But I feel quite grateful that perfectionism hasn't been as blighting on me as other people. And I look back and I see my mum, who's also definitely got ADHD. And actually, she wasn't a perfectionist, but that bothered me because I used to look at what she did and think, why doesn't she care? Like, why didn't she care that this wasn't perfect or that wasn't right? Or the room didn't look, or the food wasn't presented properly. And it bothered me because for me, it was important. But now I kind of look back and I think she's still quite like that. Like she just doesn't really care. Whereas I do quite like things nice and presentable and things to look and taste good and the house to be tidy and all of that. But I think her moderation has helped me dial it down a little bit because I've seen. Whereas I know that other people that have lived with a perfectionist parent, that impact it can have can really be like the beginning stages of it just being all encompassing.
Yeah. And I'd say I fit into that category of having perfectionist parents. So I guess my mum is the kind of person who the house would look absolutely perfect and spotless. The food would be perfectly presented and delicious. And I guess every way you could sort of be perfect. And yeah, I guess when you grow up with that experience, that kind of becomes your norm. That's sort of what you're used to, that's what you like, but then also that's what you expect of yourself. And I think that's why for lots of people, and particularly women, that then it can kind of, if you have got either diagnosed or undiagnosed ADHD, it can feel kind of quite jarring once then you're an adult yourself and you're finding it harder to have this perfectly tidy house all of the time or to be a perfect cook. I guess, again, that word shame comes up, I think, a lot with perfectionists. It can certainly add to that sense of shame.
Yeah. And going back to that, I won't ask too many personal questions about your mum, but she must have been exhausted keeping this. I don't know if it was a facade or it was something that, felt quite natural to her, but it is exhausting having to keep this external facade up, this mask. We know about this, especially with women diagnosed later on in life, that we have been masking. And we know that the masking very much leads to burnout, leads to us just crumbling at some point, often during sort of hormonal times where we just don't have that grit, that resilience, the scaffolding, I guess, the internal scaffolding to kind of like keep it up. And we do crumble. And I guess we then feel like even worse, like even more of a hot mess, even more less in control. And this backwards and forwards of like, why am I like this? And why do I feel this need to sort of overcompensate? And then we get this understanding of ADHD. And that's just kind of like the light bulb moment. But then it's kind of like, now what? And I want to talk to you about the now what. But
Yeah.
what kind of led you to your diagnosis when you knew that there was all these perfectionist sort of tendencies already there?
Yeah. So I think for me, I was never the person who had sort of always wondered for years or over the years, which I know lots of people have that experience. I was one of the ones who kind of had that real light bulb moment of like, oh my God, I've got ADHD. And I'd never sort of thought that before. But I think I definitely fit into that very common pattern of once you have kids, just all the demands go up. And so your kind of previous ways of managing things and coping, it's just not working in the same way anymore. And I've also got twins. And I guess in terms of hormones, of course, when you're pregnant, your hormones are going crazy all over the place. And when you've got twins, it's like double the amount of hormones. And so I definitely experienced so much of that baby brain that everyone talks about. And I mean, it was just next level baby brain. Like I would drive home in my car, get out of the car, go to the front door, and then be like, oh God, I haven't turned the engine off or put the handbrake on. And the car's starting to roll towards the house. Like just so forgetful. And I think it kind of brought all of that stuff more to the surface for me to see or kind of notice more. And then I guess also really common for so many women, but once you have your baby, or for me, babies, again, your hormones are still just all over the place, especially if you've been breastfeeding for a period of time. And I think I just remember thinking and asking other women, does the baby brain go at some point? Because mine isn't going. I feel like mine's just getting worse. And so I think that was sort of going on for me, and bringing all of the, I guess, more of the inattentive ADHD symptoms to the forefront. Of course, all the demands had gone up. You know, you're looking after two babies, it's quite full on. And then going back to work, working as deputy clinical lead in an NHS service, also doing my private practice alongside, plus being a new mum. And I guess I just noticed feeling quite overwhelmed. I experienced anxiety or depression in the past, and I remember thinking, I'm definitely not depressed. It's definitely not anxiety, but it's something, and I'm not sure what it is. I think I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by like my to-do list and keeping on top of routines and structure and things. And I guess it was really interesting that whilst all that stuff was happening, at the same time, I'd been working on my private practice and kind of figuring out my ideal client and marketing. And so I was starting to attract more of my ideal clients. So, like millennial women who are maybe high achievers, high functioning anxiety, sort of stressed, burnt out, overwhelmed, low self esteem. And quite a few of my clients had ADHD. And so I thought, okay, I've learned about it before. I know a little bit about it, but again, like lots of people, from more of that sort of stereotypical young boy, fidgety type stuff, basically like my younger brother who has ADHD. But I really then started to learn more about it in women. And maybe, I guess, without realizing, I've been starting to think about it a little bit. Yeah. And it was actually then just one day where I sat down and I did like a deep dive, probably very ADHD, but like hyper focus, music in, song on repeat, reading, loving it, learning. And just, 2 hours in, I was suddenly like, oh my God, this is me. I'm learning about me. I've got ADHD.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty profound. I mean, first of all, how old are your twins now?
They'll be 3 next year, beginning of next year.
Wow. I mean, that is just so intense, isn't it? And like how you can have been thrown into motherhood. And, I'm sure people would have said, of course you're overwhelmed. You've got twins, of course, but the fact that you knew intrinsically, because very often, you have people who are a little bit ignorant will say, of course you're going to be scattered. You're a mum, you're not getting enough sleep, or, life gets, busy and all of that. But if you're able to look at those traits that you were experiencing after, having the babies, and know that they kind of showed up in different capacities, in different moments of your life. And then that as we know with women with ADHD, our hormones exacerbate, turn up the acceleration on everything. And you can be overwhelmed by life without ADHD, but we know that with ADHD, the overwhelm just feels chronic, ongoing. It feels very difficult to manage. And I think with children, for myself, I noticed my ADHD definitely get worse. Purely not, I think I just kind of winged a lot of parenting, a lot of motherhood. And I did get a little bit fixated on routines and realized actually the routines for me were working like it was working for other people. But what I really noticed, it was my overthinking, my catastrophization, my worry, my anxiety. I would wake up in the middle of the night and like almost be sleepwalking into my kids' rooms, checking. I used to have these sort of nightmares that, they were in water and I couldn't get to them.
Mm.
And I think it was just so much in my head. There was just so much going on and so much worry
Yeah.
that I don't think it's talked about enough, actually, these sort of specifics of the overwhelm and the anxiety when you are a mum, and the ADHD sort of comes to a forefront because from externally, I kind of had things covered ish, and I was fortunate to get help. I had a cleaner who was like my godsend. And I knew that if I didn't have that help, I think possibly things would unravel very,
Mm.
very quickly.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know, how did your partner respond when you kind of said, I think it's ADHD? Like,
Yeah.
do you mind me
Yeah,
asking what
no,
they
it's
said?
fine. Well, funnily enough, they were actually either downstairs maybe, or perhaps they were at the house, but I just messaged them on WhatsApp randomly and just said, oh my God, I think I've got ADHD. And he actually replied saying, yeah, I know, I think I've told you that before. And I was like, what? Sorry, I don't remember this, which obviously I wouldn't remember because I've got a terrible memory. Um, and yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that to pretty much everyone else in my life, I don't think anyone would think or ever put me as the person who they would describe as sort of being or having ADHD. But I think it's the people who live with you, they're the ones who really see the things that you might struggle with, like struggling to switch off at night and go to bed. Like no one else is going to see that, or struggling to keep up with a particular sort of habit or routine. We kind of laugh. I mean, I still do this now anyway, but anytime I'd go to Tesco's to get a snack or something, and my fiance would say, oh, can you get me this? 9 times out of 10, I would come back and I would have forgotten his snack. And I guess you kind of laugh, but also those are the things that, going back to that word shame again, that can just make you feel really awful. And you're thinking like, well, that's not nice. I've forgotten what they wanted. I'm feeling really bad here. It's not that I don't care. It's just I genuinely would like get distracted and forget. And I think that's why it's so helpful. Then once you know and you're diagnosed with ADHD, you're just able to then be so much kinder to yourself and know that's no reflection on me as a person. It's purely just I've got distracted and I forgot. It doesn't mean I don't care or, I'm mean for forgetting something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they definitely weren't surprised, funnily enough. But I think also actually maybe helpful to mention is that what I think also helped me to sort of identify at that time is that I'd also really worked on my perfectionism. And so in the past, I think lots of things that perhaps were actually more of an ADHD symptom without having that sort of deeper knowledge of ADHD and particularly how ADHD presents in women, I would tend to just put it all down to perfectionism and think I'm procrastinating because I'm a perfectionist, or I'm all or nothing because I'm a perfectionist. And so actually it was working on my perfectionism that then allowed me to see more clearly that there was something else happening. And I guess, I'm a therapist, so naturally I am going to be quite curious and sort of approach things in a certain way that you might not do if you're not a therapist. But I remember, say, with procrastination, for example, I got really curious about why I was procrastinating because I knew in the past I would notice more of this needs to be perfect, I don't want to fail, blah, 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 more of the perfectionist stuff. Whereas
Mhm.
that wasn't showing up anymore because I wasn't as fussed about that anymore because I'd worked on my perfectionism, but I was still procrastinating. And this time I couldn't really put my finger on what it was, but I knew there was something going on. So initially I actually started reading about like self-sabotage because I was thinking, maybe that's a thing and that's what I'm experiencing. And then obviously, yeah, started to read more about ADHD and thought, that's what it is, actually.
Hi, so I'm just coming back with our sponsor for today's podcast, and it is sleepypeople.com. I absolutely love their products. Sleepy People has got everything if you want to create a sanctuary of sleep. Now, we know sleep is so important for our nervous system, for our brains, to regenerate, to reduce inflammation, to regulate our cortisol. I talk about sleep all the time, but sometimes with ADHD, we struggle to find the sleep. We struggle to rest. We struggle to get into that place where we feel held and safe and cozy. And something that I recommend a lot to my clients is a weighted blanket. Now, weighted blankets are amazing if you are neurodivergent, because that feeling of being held and being sort of like a heavy weight on you just all of a sudden just calms that nervous system. It tells your nervous system it's okay. You can go into parasympathetic mode. It's okay and it's safe to rest. And that is why I love a weighted blanket. They are amazing for kids and for adults, and they have them both on sleepypeople.com. So if you go to sleepypeople.com, look for weighted blankets. They've got gorgeous warm ones, perfect for this time of year. Watch TV, lie in the bed, you can sleep with them. If you've got a snuggle pod, the Silent Night snuggle pod, which is this sort of human-sized dog bed, fluffy, gorgeous thing, you lie in that with the weighted blanket. Oh my God, it's incredible. And if you have a neurodivergent child and they struggle to rest and relax and decompress, I promise you the combination of the snuggle pod and the weighted blanket, I think you'll really find that they rest and they relax and they regulate themselves a lot easier. So if you go to sleepypeople.com, put in my code, which is Kate15, Kate15, you'll get 15% off. That's sleepypeople.com, and it's Kate15 is my code. And just to let you know, unfortunately, Sleepy People only ship within the UK right now. So this is only available for listeners who are in the UK. Now back to today's episode. I'm going to be totally honest here. Yesterday, I had a really, really bad day. And the bad day was just lots of things, work things, life things, feeling very overwhelmed. And it ended up with me opening a speeding ticket when I got
Oh,
home after I just got a parking ticket while I was in the
what
hairdressers.
a nightmare.
So in one day, it was like building, building, building. And I was already feeling quite fragile anyway for other reasons. And I just kind of got to last night and I just sat down and cried. And I said to my husband, I said, I feel like everything is just falling apart, like I'm not coping. And he has the insight now, and I have the insight that we know there's ADHD. We understand that, like, yes, I can feel quite easily overwhelmed. Things can fall apart. I knew when I got my speeding ticket, it was because I was rushing to the train. I had to get on the train, a really important train. And I got my parking ticket yesterday because I was running late for my hairdresser. So instead of parking in the long stay, I winged it and parked in the 2 hour stay. And, you know, obviously being in the hairdresser, things take longer. And I was 10 minutes late and I got the parking ticket.
Oh,
But I kind of understand all of this now. Instead of it being a
yeah,
direct personality flaw, and I would have shamed myself and criticized myself, I just kind of give myself a bit more self-compassion.
yeah.
Yes, very annoying. Got a parking ticket and a speeding ticket, and I'm
ADHD
going to have to deal with
hacks,
this
right? Yeah,
100%. And you think after sort of like 4 or 5 years of awareness of
yeah,
ADHD, I would be on top of these things, but it's still, and I have these conversations, hundreds of hours of conversations, and it still hits me like a sledgehammer sometimes. And we just have to get on with that. And I guess lean into it. And that's what I wanted to kind of move on to of your way of dealing with perfectionism isn't actually kind of pushing it away and like trying to get rid of it. You lean into it and you're like, well, actually, how can this help me? Like, how can this serve me? And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
yeah, definitely. Well, I think so often when we hear or read about perfectionism, we only think of the negative sides, and it absolutely can be really negative. Like we were talking about at the beginning, it can have an impact on our mental health and it puts lots of pressure on us, etc. But I think that, and certainly my experience as a perfectionist, but also having worked with hundreds of perfectionists, is that when we try and approach it with this sort of mindset of perfectionism is all bad and I need to overcome it and I need to get rid of it. And even when we refer to ourselves as a recovering perfectionist, which I used to think of or kind of call myself, but I don't anymore, is that I think it can be really unhelpful because it's so hard to not be a perfectionist at all. And also, I'm yet to meet any perfectionist who doesn't like some part of their perfectionism or being a
Yeah.
perfectionist. And so I kind of just thought, why are we all trying to force ourselves to overcome this thing and then feeling really rubbish when it's not working and was, kind of failing to overcome it? Actually, maybe it's going to feel a lot more helpful to just accept that perfectionism, technically, it's not a mental health problem, it is a personality trait. And therefore, if it's part of our personality, let's actually just try and embrace it and stop trying to sort of not be a perfectionist and instead focus on how can we learn to manage our perfectionism, so deal with the unhealthy, unhelpful parts of it, but then also try and harness the positive, helpful, healthy parts of it,
Hmm.
aiming more to try and learn how to thrive as a perfectionist, not stop being a perfectionist.
Yeah, I love that. So how does that look? Let's get practical. Let's kind of like maybe come up with an anonymous fictional kind of client that we can maybe workshop around, because I think what's really helpful, we have these conversations and we're there, we're vulnerable, we're truthful. I want to make sure that the audience is kind of thinking, okay, I can really relate to all of this. Thank you for all the honesty. But how do I move through this if maybe I can't afford therapy? And how do I embrace and use my perfectionism, like you say, manage it and have it there as a part of our personality that doesn't feel like it's taking over, or like we can kind of utilize it for good.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I guess I think it's a good place to start is trying to just get to the root of your perfectionism a little bit, which of course I think is easier done, with a therapist in therapy, but it doesn't have to be. You can just sit down and reflect on your own life or journal, to get a sense of maybe where your perfectionism has come from, why it might have developed. So, for lots of women with ADHD, that's why it's developed as a way to cope with or compensate for their symptoms. But for other people, it might be that they had really critical parents that put lots of pressure on them to perform and always, get 100% at school, etc. So just taking the time to reflect maybe why it's developed, I think is helpful because it can just start to build in that compassion for yourself to see, okay, it kind of makes sense that I've developed perfectionism, or that, I'm a perfectionist. And also in that reflecting piece is you're going to spot and see where maybe it's also helped you, or you feel like, yeah, that was maybe a part of why I did get all A's and A stars, because I worked extra hard because of my perfectionism. So yeah, I think starting off figuring out the root of it, and then I guess it's getting a sense of when it shows up in an unhelpful way and what that looks like. So maybe it's procrastination, maybe it's people pleasing, overthinking, self criticism, all that fun stuff that women with ADHD in particular know all about, and kind of working on one thing at a time. Let's not put pressure on ourselves to try and do everything all at once, because we wouldn't do that in therapy. It's just too overwhelming. We want things to be challenging but not overwhelming. So maybe thinking, okay, I'm going to pick one of the things I'm struggling with, procrastination, for example. How can I work on that? How can I create some small wins? So I'm not going with that all or nothing approach. I need to totally overcome my procrastination or I failed. It's what kind of tweaks can I make? Experimenting with different ways of doing things. Because of course everyone's different. So some people with procrastination, let's say, maybe they'd work better doing a piece of work in the morning because that's when they can focus
Mm,
best. But for other people, they're going to procrastinate less if they work in the evenings. Or maybe for some people, it helps them to do the hardest task first, get that out of the way. Then the sort of the fear's gone and they can relax a bit and do the other ones. But for other people, it's going to be the other way. Let's do an easy one first, tick that off, feel good, bit of dopamine. Now I can move on to the harder one that I've been avoiding. So I think often sort of, yeah, testing things out. And then also, yeah, looking at where it shows up in a helpful way. What parts of your perfectionism do you like, and how can you try and build on that in some way? Because I think so often we tend to focus on our negatives, and we really need to try and shift that into celebrating our achievements, celebrating our wins, no matter how small, because often we just discount all of the positives, particularly when you're a
mhm.
perfectionist as well. There's a real habit of just discounting anything positive and thinking everyone can do that, or I should have just been able to do that anyway. It's nothing great, and then you're kind of raising the bar even higher every single time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it kind of blends in with imposter syndrome as
Yeah,
well, that doesn't it?
yeah.
Which we know many of us have dealt with and suffer with. And it's a really tricky one because I think with imposter syndrome, you just never feel like you're good enough. And addressing that alongside the perfectionism as well, of it being, I mean, for me, I think maybe my perfectionism has definitely showed up in imposter syndrome.
Mm,
And that's just always been like a bit of a mantra in my head of, I've said it a few times even in this conversation, just winging it. I'm just sort of like winging it and just kind of, muscling through and just hopefully, something kind of sticks. Where if I was my client, I would say, well, look what you've achieved, look what
yeah,
you've done. It's been through lots of hard
exactly.
work and persistence and growth and failure and picking yourself up again and pivoting and changing.
Yeah,
And
resilience.
yeah, that's kind of like my self-talk, especially say yesterday when I literally was on the floor in my bedroom saying to my husband, like, I can't do this anymore type thing. And so it comes to me quicker now, the voice of, but look at what you've achieved, look how you've done, and you've done this on your own.
Yeah, so I think this is where mindfulness can be really helpful, because often it's really good to do thought challenging, which we do a lot of in CBT, challenging those negative, unhelpful thoughts that happen. But sometimes, no matter how much we do that, there might always be some thoughts that will linger on, or maybe might always be there for however many months, years, or forevermore. And I think having a mindfulness approach to those is more useful. So, thinking of a personal example, if I ever get any kind of self-critical thoughts, or you haven't done a good enough job with this thing, rather than feeling like I need to go and challenge that and, say, well, you did this well, or etc. Instead, the mindfulness approach for me is more of a, oh, here's the old classic, you haven't done a good enough job. Hi there, thanks for coming. Great, cool, have a nice day. I'm just going to go back to focusing on whatever it was that I was focusing on. So I'm kind of just acknowledging the thoughts there. I've noticed it. I'm not trying to push it away. I'm allowing it to be there, but I'm just now not going to really engage much with it. And again, I think that can feel quite helpful, rather than that sort of pressure that we can have as perfectionists to feel like, we need to overcome something, we need to conquer it, I need to challenge my thought and get rid of this unhelpful one. Maybe that's not
Yeah.
always going to be realistic.
I love that. It's a much more gentle approach, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially when we're already exhausted by our own thinking and our mind. And it's so important to remember that our thoughts actually aren't always true. Like genuinely, it's only up until relatively recently that I believed everything I thought. Like I genuinely, if I thought it, it's real. And I've now been able to recognize that some of my thoughts are very helpful, the imagination,
Mm,
creativity, insights, ideas, all of that. And sometimes I can be like, that was a thought that I can just let go of because that's not serving me, or that's not for me, right now, or just recognizing it and moving on. Um,
yeah.
and we can see that with perfectionism. We can see that, like, that negative inner voice, that criticism that can be sort of very pervasive and
Mhm. Yeah.
insistent, doesn't have to be the leading kind of character anymore. Like we can choose for it to not be.
Yeah. That was actually, I remember a real moment when I was doing my mindfulness teacher training, is that I felt like it was, I think, on the day of silence, and you're supposedly meant to have some fantastic epiphany. And I was just like, this is not happening for me. And I was looking at everyone else and they all looked really cool and calm and relaxed. And I was like, they're just having these like incredible insights. And I'm just sat here like 10,000 different thoughts, distracted, thinking about other things. And I was like, it's not happening for me. And then at some point, right at the end, I did have a moment, because I think there were these perfectionist thoughts, the self-criticism of like, you've just wasted a whole day, you haven't had any great insights. And I just had a moment where I was like, I don't actually have to sort of agree with that or act on that or do anything with that. I can just let it be there and kind of that again, almost bringing in a bit of humor of like, hi, thanks for coming. Here you are again. Nice to see you. And actually, then I kind of realized that was quite a big shift and insight for me to have because, as you say, it is a more gentle approach, but I feel like it's a more useful approach, and something that I often share with my clients that is always helpful is any times when you are having those self-critical thoughts is to just ask yourself, what would I say to a friend in this
Mm.
moment? Because 9 times out of 10, our response is going to be far more compassionate if it's a friend or a loved one versus when it's ourselves. And I think when we ask that question, what would I say to a friend? It just helps us to shift a little bit into a different way of looking at things, something that often is gentler and is more compassionate.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. I think these conversations are so important because when we can spell it out and how it shows up sort of in day to day life and how it can impact us in all areas of our life as well, that this perfectionism isn't just this sort of surface layer thing. It can be very deep rooted and it can be there from childhood. And like you say, you saw it in your mum and you saw it in how it was in the house. And it's just making that recognition that, okay, now I understand what it is and I can see it. And like you say, you can almost like have this conversation with it and sort of say, yes, thank you. You've served me. You helped me get through school, university. You got me into the career. You've helped me stay organized. You've helped me feel kind of like I'm in
Yeah.
control. But actually, right now, I feel like we're obviously talking to the perfectionism right now. I feel like I want things to be easier or more gentle and I'm going to choose other options. And that to me feels really empowering.
Yeah, definitely. Almost kind of like, yeah, thanking the perfectionism, but saying, you can sit down and relax for a bit now. I've got this.
100%. Yeah. So, can I ask? I know you work online. I think it's amazing. You've obviously got your twins. Life is very
Yeah.
busy. Do you find that now that you are curating a way of living that feels more effortless to you and more simple?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I've left my NHS job where I worked in a big team, so I can just focus on my private practice, which I think that in itself is helpful because I guess you're sort of reducing the demand and that there's one less different thing to have to manage, like one less inbox. That in itself is fantastic. Reduces the
Absolutely.
overwhelm. And I think it's also great because it means every day I'm excited for what I'm doing and I'm feeling really motivated. And of course, we know for ADHD brains, that helps a lot more. And I can kind of create more variety in my day, which again feels more exciting, novel, new, different things to do. Yeah, I think sometimes there can be the sense that as therapists, we've got everything figured out. We always have our shit together perfectly, but we are just human beings as well. And whilst we might have more kind of knowledge and insight into some things, or we might know about more tools and techniques, it doesn't mean we're immune to struggling with things, or, we might not always keep on top of all of our healthy habits that we're trying to build. And I guess for me is just knowing that it's a journey and a process. There isn't this sort of end point. And the same, I guess, with perfectionism. It's not about striving to try and overcome it and get rid of it. It's just learning how to manage it in a helpful way. Some days are going to
Yeah.
be better than others, and that's fine. So I think, yeah, I'm able to have a lot more compassion for myself and just kind of roll with it more. Whereas before, especially pre ADHD diagnosis, but also when my perfectionism was much more in that unhealthy range versus now generally being more in that healthy range, there's kind of less of that like, you've failed, you've messed up, you need to, start all again with your routine or something. Now it's more just, you missed a few days, fine, never mind, carry on again today.
Yeah. How wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all your insights and your story. And I guess people will want to know how they can work with you, especially because you work online, so you can see anyone around the world. Yeah, how can people find you?
Yeah, well, I'm on Instagram as the Perfectionism Therapist. So people can come and find me there, and they can head to my website from Instagram as well, and get in touch there. People can either book straight into an initial appointment, or they can book an intro call if they just want to see, would we be a good fit to work together, ask me any questions. And so, yeah, I offer one-to-one online cognitive behavioral therapy that incorporates mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and also compassion-focused therapy, which for me, I think I try not to use the word perfect and actually mean it, but for me, it feels like the perfect combination for perfectionists, and also particularly for women with ADHD who are also perfectionists. I've also got a newsletter, The Diary of a Perfectionist, where I try and share a bit more about my own experiences of being a perfectionist. So when it's maybe showed up in an unhealthy way, and how I've made sense of that, and then what I've done, the kind of positive changes or actions I've taken to try and get things back into a healthy, helpful path.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, you're doing so much. I hope you're giving yourself some time as well, because having
Yeah.
twins is not easy, especially toddlers as well. So I hope you get a
Oh,
bit of time just for you and
yeah,
yeah, just kind of nourishing you.
thank you.
But Natalie, I just want to thank you so much. Love this conversation, and I think it's going to really resonate with so many people. So thank you for being
Thank
here.
you so much for having me.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, I invite you to check out my brand new subscription podcast called The Toolkit. Now, this is where I'm going to be opening up my entire library, my vault of information from over the years, my workshops, webinars, and courses, my conversations with experts about hormones, nutrition, lifestyle, and bringing brand new, up-to-date content from global experts. This is going to be an amazing resource for you to support you and guide you even more on more niche topics and conversations so you can really thrive and learn to live your best life with ADHD. I'm so excited about this. Please just check out It's the Toolkit on Apple Podcast and you get a free trial. Really hope to see you there.
Simple